Okay, great. Good afternoon. My name is Allison Sarauer, and I'm the chair of the Westminster Affirm team here in Humboldt. We're a core group of 5 people, including Ty Scogan, Lou Moore, Clark Curtis, Renee McKenzie, and Carol Hoffus. And we're thankful for the wisdom and support of Reverend Brenda. The Westminster Community of Faith is a welcoming place, but in late 2019, we decided to take that welcome a step further to educate and increase our awareness around becoming an affirming ministry, one that declares its commitment to inclusion and justice for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And since beginning our journey, our work has expanded as we search for ways to live more fully into God's way of justice, love, and welcome for all creation. We are adding learning opportunities that help us challenge bias and discrimination based on appearance, culture, class, and age. We're working to recognize and end racism and to promote economic justice and increased accessibility for all. And so today, I would like to welcome you to the What is Intercultural Church workshop, where we will explore the questions, why become an affirming community of faith, and how are LGBTQ2S+ welcome and anti-racism connected. Our guest presenters are ministers from St. Martin's United Church in Saskatoon, which has graciously lent us them for the afternoon, and our sincere appreciation goes out to St. Martin's. Jordan Cantwell sits on the anti-racism working group of the General Council Executive and is a proud member of Affirm United. She loves the Bible and the rich resources it offers for a life rooted in justice and love. Hey, Jordan. And Keith Hall celebrates his ministry at St. Martin's, which publicly affirms that diversity is a true gift of God and that all people belong. St. Martin's commitment to living in right relationship with our Creator, ourselves, and the wider community enables Keith's passion in the areas of radical welcoming, outreach, and social justice work for all ages. Jordan and Keith are well known to us at Westminster Community through their involvement with the Team Mexico groups, Jordan's time as the moderator of the United Church of Canada, and Keith's early dedicated commitment to walking with us on our Westminster Affirm journey. We're truly thankful to you for sharing your time and knowledge, and welcome back to be with us. We're excited about this workshop as it will be addressing the intersection of many groups that are oppressed and or marginalized, and how their and our liberation are all tied up together. This workshop is being recorded for those who are unable to attend today, and we ask that you keep your microphones muted unless you wish to speak during the question and answer sections. And Keith and Jordan, I'll turn the reins over to you now.
Thanks, Allison. I'll speak on behalf of my colleague and say that we're both really pleased to be here and be asked to chat with you today. I would hesitate to guess that neither of us are experts. We've had some experience and we're happy to share that with you. Certainly not the only knowledge that's available on all of this. So, you know, there's lots and lots of resources available for you to refer to. I would like to begin today with a poem, actually. Early on in the pandemic, Jordan discovered and shared with me this wonderful book called What the Earth Already Knows. And it's a collection of poems written by Kim McKellar that actually were written, I think, to create some solace around the pandemic, but also to find ways of sort of relating the natural world to what we were experiencing. And I believe the conversations around diversity are very much part of the natural world. And so there's one that is a particular favorite of mine, and I think it speaks to our conversation today, and I apologize to my colleague for having to listen to it again, because it's my favorite. So she says, "From the upstairs window, I saw a crow fly west, heading, I assume, for the barn behind my house. The wind kicked up and blew against him and lifted him high and then pushed him back so hard it seemed as if he was still, like in a photograph. He didn't struggle. not that I could see. I watched him give back to the current, drift back, and then with the wind urging him on, he turned and flew northeast, knowing as wild things do that changing course is not the same thing as defeat. And I think it's important when we're talking to our fellow congregation members about being inclusive, about being affirming, that we recognize that what we're doing is enriching our lives together as a community and not defeating, not in any way defeating each other. And so, having said that, I'd like to talk just briefly, just very briefly, about our um, our experience of becoming an affirming congregation and our process at St. Martin. I was the staff liaison for it, and as a gay man, I was incredibly impatient that we had to go through this. We had to. You're asking us, oh, we're welcoming. Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to? And I was one of them, to be honest, even though, you know, I was the one who was, you know, helping a group of people to instigate the affirming process in our congregation. And as we went through it, my impatience grew because I really believed at St. Martin's that, you know, if we were to have that vote tomorrow, man, it would pass. It would pass. What I came to understand over the three years that it took us through our affirming process was that within the process of becoming an affirming congregation and of moving, maybe, and you've already alluded to this, but maybe moving away from human sexuality as the primary focus and looking at inclusion and diversity as a continuum. That there were so many gifts that I would have missed, that we would have missed, if we hadn't done the process that we engaged in. And so those gifts, and there were also many challenges, but those challenges still gifted us with knowledge and a sense of where our congregation was, and so even the challenges were helpful and helped us to learn. And I would just encourage you to be patient, to work through the process, because you know what, you probably are an affirming congregation, but the the process and all of the things that you do, all of the education events that you engage in, all of the conversations you have, uh, move you towards a place where at the end, when you decide whether you're going to become an affirming congregation or not, you probably have more of a consensus within your congregation than you have a 52% vote, which would have happened for us if we had, you know, done it at the beginning of the process. And I don't want to in any way say that our process was perfect. It was not. We made mistakes along the way, and so will you. And just, you know, allow yourself the grace of God to, you know, to make mistakes and to sort through the stuff that you need to go through in your context. The other thing that I need to acknowledge, and Jordan and I were chatting a little bit about this the other day, and it's really, really important that we acknowledge this, is that our context was very different than yours is. And so Jordan and I come from a context where we are a large urban church where we can, we can operate anonymously within the community, I guess, if you want to put it like that. I mean, we put ourselves out there into the community more so now than we did prior to our affirming process, I suppose. But it's important for us to acknowledge as presenters that your context is very different, being in a small rural community where you do have the eyes of the community on you. And so I would offer that takes more resolve and more discipleship, more asking the hard questions and hearing hard answers. And so I want to acknowledge that, and I want to lift you up for the position that you're in your community. And I hope that that what we are able to give to you today is useful within your context, but we're not presuming that. And so if you do have questions that you need to ask us specifically related to your community, please don't hesitate. I think that's all I wanted to say in beginning, so I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith, for getting us going. Yeah, super excited to be here. One of the first questions that I think you folks pose to us is, if we're already welcoming, why is it important to become large A affirming? And that's a really great question. And I think most congregations that go through the affirming process begin with that question, because I think many congregations, by the time they decide that they want to go into the affirming process, have already gotten to a place where they feel like a pretty welcoming community. And so they're like, well, aren't we already there? And so not in any way to diminish the work you've already done, and like that you are already a safe and welcoming community is not in dispute at all. The importance of the affirming process, Keith has alluded to some of it, is that it helps bring more folks along. And as Keith said, your context is one where your neighbors who are not part of the United Church, who might be part of churches that are explicitly not affirming, are folks that folks that you're running into at the rink, who if and when you decide to become affirming, are going to have questions for you. And these are people that matter to you. These are your neighbors. And so part of the affirming process is developing the language and the biblical and theological sort of language and understanding to be able to answer those questions, to be able to respond to neighbors in a loving, caring, honest kind of way, that, rather than sort of saying, it's just who we are, and so deal with it, right? Which doesn't really work when you're talking to friends and neighbors. It's not a great response to anybody, but you can kind of do that with somebody you don't know or care about. But family and friends doesn't work. So the process equips folks to be able to speak beyond just, well, we think it's the right thing to do, and to have some language and deeper understanding behind that. But it communicates something very important to the folks that you want to say this is a safe place for you. Almost any church, anywhere you go, will have on their sign or in their literature, everyone is welcome here. I mean, it's almost like a given that every church says everyone is welcome here. Very few churches want to say some of you aren't welcome here. You never see that on church literature. But folks who have historically been excluded or vilified within faith communities know that everyone doesn't necessarily mean them. And I often like to use the example of if you go to a clothing store and you pull out an article of clothing that says one size fits all. Well, a whole bunch of folks know that that's not them, that they are not included in that all. There really are no garments that fit all, because people come in such a range of sizes. So if you see one size fits all, but you know that never means you, then one size fits all is just almost code for not me. In the same way that everyone is welcome here, for some people, they just know that doesn't mean me. So that's the affirming process, is to help equip communities to be truly affirming and to have thought through what does it mean when folks come through the door who might have a really different experience of church and of life, and how will we be a community that is safe for them. And it also communicates to the folks that you're trying to reach. It says, we've done our work. We've gone through a process. We're not just everyone's welcome here, but we are a capital A affirming, which means we've gone through an education process. We've had these conversations as community, and we have agreed. and have come to, if not total consensus, a significant consensus that this is a place of welcome and safety and inclusion for folks. So it's for you, and it's for the folks for whom you want to express a welcome. But being affirming is also about more than just being a place of welcome. And we're going to talk about this in a sort of expanded way, but even the language of welcome, which is, it's very friendly, open language, but it does imply that those who welcome are in the position of power to be able to welcome others in. So for example, I welcome people into my home, right? My home is a welcoming place for guests, but it's really clear this is my home and you are a guest when you come here, just as I'm a guest when you welcome me into your home. And so when you're in my home, I can be very hospitable to you, but the big decisions about where the furniture is going to be and what's being served for supper and who gets to just go to the fridge, those are mine. I get to decide that. And so welcoming is a great first step for churches that have historically, which is all of us, historically been not welcoming of some people, not even really been very friendly about letting them in the door. Doing our work to become a place of welcome is really important, but we don't want to stop there. The affirming process is an ongoing process that leads us beyond welcome to real inclusion. To say, you're not just welcome to come here and sort of observe or even participate in what it is we do here, but we want you to be part of it. We want you to join in and be part of this community, which is sort of the next step. And then there's another step that we have to get to beyond that, which is to really foster a sense of belonging. And that's a different thing. That's, to go back to the house analogy, if you belong here, it means it's your house as much as it's mine, which means that now there's, like I share decision-making with you. And you share it with me. There's no sort of like, I grant you these privileges, but rather we all belong here, and collectively we make the decisions. Collectively we determine what our life together is going to be like and how we're going to do things. And that's our ultimate goal. But it's always a process, and it's to go from, we're not really actually sure that we want people who are different than who's already here to be here, to the belonging, like everyone who comes belongs fully. And, few of us can make that kind of jump. But in your congregation, you will have folks who are at every stage, like who are pushing for, we need to be more welcoming, and others are like, well, we need to move way beyond welcome. We want to really include people, and others who are like, yeah, we need to share decision making. We need to, the culture of our church has to be a shared thing, right? And so it's always a balance. Like, you're always wanting to move people to the next step, knowing that you will always have people at all of those stages. And so some will be very, very impatient, and some will be freaking out that you're going where, right? And that's the dynamic that we all have to deal with all the time, not just around this stuff, but around anything, around inclusive language and around all the sort of changes that we make in church. We've always got people at all those. So that's just something to be aware of. And each of those stages, I guess, have different elements to them and different kind of language. So I don't know if it's helpful to pause to sort of say, are there any questions about that so far before we dive into the next thing? Or do you just want us to save all the questions for the end? I don't know.
Does anyone have any questions right now, or do you want to think about it and type them into the chat? Or um, I think the people that are here, some are involved in the Affirm team, some are interested in learning more. Um, so if you have any questions, yeah, I can see so much in what you say about the different stages people are at. That's so true, so true. So should we just go ahead, or if you want
Yeah,
to say something, you can
I
unmute.
think I might add a couple of things to Jordan's comments, and I think that the the one thing about belonging is that it intrinsically means that we are going to be changed. That that our community is not going to be the community it was before we radically welcomed, right? And that can be really hard for people. And I will be really honest with you, St. Martin's is still dealing with that, you know, and we're five or 6 years down the road. And it crops up often when things happen. So this last summer, when all of the churches in Saskatoon were vandalized, that's when we put the flag on the front of our church after 5 years. I mean, we had the pink triangle already, but you know, a flag flying in front of your church is a pretty, you know, solid symbol of where you are, in and so the symbols, the things that we do, to mark ourselves as publicly, you know, big A affirming, become really important in my opinion. But again, I think they need to be added, not with discretion, but as th as things happen within your community that sort of warrant them, I guess. I would have loved to have put a flag on the church the very first day after we became affirming, but even though our vote was, you know, a consensus, I still think that might have pushed people too hard. And so I think you need to be a little bit aware of sort of where your congregation is and how they're functioning. And the other thing is that the power dynamic that Jordan was talking about is so important, not only to the congregation members that, you know, you're dealing with in your affirming congregation, but also to the people who are coming into your church, because with them arriving, your community changes. And all of a sudden those folks, if you're truly allowing them to belong as a congregation, the power changes because it's shared then, and not just, you're not just gatekeepers, right? I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I have something I'd like to relate. Before my husband and I came to this church, we were going to a different church, and the church, certain members sort of asked us very poignantly whether we would stand against gays and lesbians, with the church against gays and lesbians. And it was like right in my face. And I said, excuse me. And he wanted to know how I felt about gays and lesbians. And I said, well, I have gay and lesbian friends, and I would be loath to call their relationship and their marriages anything less loving and less God-fearing and less kind than any heterosexual relationship I know. And that was my response. And after that, they made sure that any singing I did in the church was that the church got a copy of all the music to make sure every word was okay before I sang it. Even in a sing-song that was secular and not religious, they still had to see my music and made sure it was okay. I was not allowed anywhere near Sunday school children. for fear I would maybe teach them something wrong. And it was so refreshing when Bob found this church and we were free and able to be a part of it, and not just a part of it, but involved in it. It was just so refreshing. And I took Jordan's words and I was thinking about myself and how I was forbidden from teaching Sunday school. And all my words that I said there were censored, and how it feels for people who are outside of the norm to not just be welcomed and accepted, but also to be a part of, that we need to be a part of. We need to have responsibilities. We need to feel that we can be trusted with worship, with being a part of worship, being a part of Sunday school, being a part of whatever. That became very important to me.
So thank you, Lou, for sharing that. So
Thank you, Lou.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great example of the difference between being welcomed and being included and belonging.
Yeah. Yeah. Any
Just
other?
one,
Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
sorry. I was going to say,
No,
one
go
of the
ahead.
other things that I meant to say is that in terms of why go through the process, is the last thing any of us should want to do is to describe ourselves in a way that is inconsistent with how people will experience us. Right? So if people who have been hurt by the church kind of know to stay away from it. And what we don't want to do is assure those people we're different. Come here, we're safe. And then they take the great risk of coming to a church because they really believe they're going to have a different experience, and they don't. And they have a hurtful experience. So taking the time, as Keith said, to really help the congregation think through and move through and their hesitancies, their questions, there's no shame in that taking a while. It would be a much greater shame to not take the time and then have a trans woman show up in a dress one Sunday and somebody go, "Oh my God, why is he wearing a dress?" That would be horrifying. And it's totally preventable by doing the work ahead of time. So that by the time we are saying we're an affirming church, we can feel pretty confident that people can come in here and there can be guys holding hands and trans people coming in, and we're not going to be perfect, but that we've all but eliminated the risk of somebody really slamming up against homophobia or transphobia when they took the risk to come back to church. So that's the other important reason to do, as Keith said, and to take the time and to go through the process and think it through and move folks forward together. So back to you, Keith.
Thank you. So just actually, that's segued very nicely into what my next little section is. And that's to talk a little bit about in your process to really examine the fact that diversity truly is a gift from God. And when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about human sexuality, yes, but I'm also talking about race, I'm talking about ageism, I'm talking about ableism. I'm talking about many of the isms that we are faced in the congregation. I'm talking about people who live in poverty. One of the most horrifying experiences I ever had at St. Martin's was a person walking into our congregation who was clearly, impoverished, probably addicted, and how the congregation, even after we became an affirming congregation, did not respond the way that I had hoped they would. And so when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about all of those things. And so most people who live in poverty, most people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, certainly most of our Indigenous brothers and sisters have probably spent the majority of their lives surrounded by messages of judgment and hate and negativity about themselves, about their relationships, and often I think it would be true that they engender those comments within themselves. So many gays and lesbians are really negative about their own self-image and all of that. Some of them really have grown up in terrifying and unnameable sense of otherness, punctuated now and again by words such as, Injun, squaw, queer, fag, deviant, all of the things you want to hear. I mean, it's just out there in our society, and many of the folks that we're talking about today that are marginalized in some way receive really strong messages, condemnation from their own families, from loved ones, co-workers, friends, and particularly their faith communities, which is really quite horrifying. Sadly, churches, many churches, I don't want to say all, but many churches have historically been like Lou just described to us. I mean, they've been the loudest and the most vitriolic in their messages of hatred and condemnation. And I mean, we see that on TV. We see, at pride events, Christians carrying placards and all of that kind of stuff. We see stuff on TV all the time. Focus on the Family used to be a program that was pointed to when you want to talk about lack of acceptance, lack of inclusion, and the Bible's been used. I mean, Leviticus has been used, and we talked about that in our last workshop with Michael. So anyway, these words of hatred are often spoken in the name of Christianity. And many people on the margins hear only that side of the story. I mean, they think about that all Christians are like this, that all Christians are like this, and they might believe that God really does reject them. And so, like Jordan said, when somebody makes the effort or moves past all of their experience, all of what they've experienced, and how they feel about themselves sometimes even, to move into a community or a place that does value inclusion and justice for all, we need to be to ensure that that experience is going to be what we want it to be as an affirming congregation. And we can't assume that newcomers or people in our communities will know what we believe unless we tell them. And so we have to be explicit about that. And that's why we need to hang those flags on our churches, and we need to put the pink triangles up, or when we did our affirming thing at St. Martin's, I thought, okay, good, pink triangle on the door. And then I thought, okay, well, what about someone who can't hear? So we put a hearing sign, I hear that we have a hearing system. We put up the United Church crest that had all of the Indigenous colors in it, so that would say something to folks about where we are and on, in relationship to our Indigenous brothers and sisters and community members. And so sometimes that's a hard thing to do. It just is. It's because it really puts us out there. And in our community in St. Martin's, it would probably be less challenging than it is in yours. And so I just need to acknowledge that that your community is watching you, as I said before, much more closely than we were being watched. I mean, we could make decisions within our community, and we might get some flack from folks that live nearby the church, but we wouldn't have a community necessarily looking at us. So I just want to acknowledge that again. But all of these things, and including the mission statement that you will develop, they are specific in that they name all of these things that you have thought about, and so the mission statement part of it that comes kind of at the end of your affirming process really helps to solidify all of the work that you've done in terms of educating yourself, and the words that you choose are really important. And so we're probably not there yet at Westminster, but you need to think about it, I think, as you go along. And I think we did this rather well, actually, was thought about at the end of our process. We're going to be writing a mission statement. What do we want it to say, and what things do we need to address now so that we can be authentic in what our mission statement is going to say? Because that and the physical symbols are really what helps to open the door to folks to say, okay, maybe this place is different than what I've experienced. And I think Jordan's going to move into a little bit about making safe spaces, but I think that this is what begins the process of helping people to come through your door in a way that has them open to receiving the grace of God done. Jordan, go to.
Sure. Thanks, Keith. Yeah, and actually, one of the things that we have found is that we hear from people is that even if they don't attend any church at all, or if they attend a church but it's not the United Church, the ways that we communicate through symbols and through our mission statements have an impact on them too. Because people will say, I don't go to church anymore, not since I was a kid. But if I did go to church, I'd go to the United Church because they actually believe that I'm a worthy person. So those mission statements, that all that information we're putting out there about our beliefs and our practice of celebrating God's image in all people, is being heard and is actually transforming lives of people who never come through our doors. And so that matters that we do that. People who have been hurt and just are not going to come back to church still need to hear that God loves them. And they hear it through your mission statements. They hear it by a flag on the front of a church. They see that they are valued, and that people of faith understand that God values them, whether or not they come to church. So it's not just about who comes through the door.
Yeah.
It's about everyone who ever sees or hears anything you say or do.
Or checks your website.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And right now, like with everything being online, there are all kinds of people. If you have online service, there are all kinds of people you're never going to see in the pews who are actually connecting with your church right now. Right. And so that's just another, but so what are some of those things? I mean, we talked about some of the obvious sort of symbols that communicate this is an accessible space. This is an affirming space. So that's the sort of first layer of communication to people visually that helps make a space safe, is that people see, oh, they're actually, when they say everyone's welcome, they mean that whole rainbow of people are welcome here. All that might actually mean me. So the first sort of thing we want to do is look at our space and what is it communicating through what is visible and through what is not visible. So would queer folks, if they came to your church, see themselves reflected in the symbology and in the images that are available to them. You know, you have couples groups. I don't know how many churches still have this, but sure was a thing when I was, there would be couples groups that just assumed that couples were heterosexual, right? There'd be, are people spoken of as if they are all male or female, right? Are the washrooms, women's and men's washrooms, or is there a recognition that there's a plurality of genders? And so we've got gender neutral washrooms, or we've got, are all the washrooms gender neutral, or do we have some that are gender neutral? Does our language in both verbal and in our written materials, and this one is really hard because it's so automatic. Like, and we do it, our brothers and sisters, right? We do it all the time, right? And it's great, wonderful, inclusive language, except unless you don't identify as male or female. And then you're not a brother or a sister. What am I? So am I included? Right? So what is the language? We need to just practice using language that is even beyond that. And I loved what Keith did. Our Indigenous brothers and sisters and community members. It's just a way of, or our Indigenous relatives or our kinfolks, and right, like we just need to practice that, because for most of us, we don't even notice that. Like for me, well, I lie. I notice it because I've kind of tuned myself into it. But I can hear brother or sister and I can see myself reflected.
Yeah.
But for folks for whom it most matters, they tune into it. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you're saying, my relatives or my kinfolk, most people aren't going to be put off by that, but some folks are going to really be drawn in by it. So how are we communicating safety and belonging to people? Through our language, through the images that they see. If a Black person walks into your church, do they see themselves anywhere? The imagery that's up on the walls and in the windows and around, are they reflected there? Right? And so many of our churches, I love Advent so much, and it's become such a trying time for me because I am so committed to the racially inclusive manger scene. And I tell you, I had to paint a set. I had to paint a nativity set because I couldn't find one in the city that was actually, not all white people or all wooden figures that, are featured, that actually was explicitly racially inclusive. I got out a set of paints and I went to town on a nativity set. But that's how hard it is, right? And it's the kind of stuff we often don't even think about, right? And for those of us who are white, to walk in and all the imagery is white, it doesn't often register. We don't notice that. But for somebody walking in who is not white, I assure you they notice that. In the same way, when I walk into a place, if it's really obvious that their assumption is that everybody is heterosexual, I notice immediately. And I also notice if that clearly is not their assumption. So that's the sort of first level of how do we create safe space? Do people feel like, oh yeah, my personhood is recognized here in the language and in the images that this community uses? And then we've already talked about how, what is their experience of the people in the community? Like, are they getting the funny stares because, they don't look cisgendered or whatever, like, so, and that's part of that work that we do, and it's ongoing work. Like there's not, yes. That's sort of like, it's not like we do the workshop, we go through the X number of years of affirming process, and now miraculously nobody has a rotten experience when they walk in here anymore. That will not happen. So then what do we do when we trip up? What do we do when somebody gets hurt? What do we do when people tell somebody to get out of the washroom because they're in the wrong one, right? Or whatever, because that will happen. And so that's part of creating a safe space, is that people can know if they come forward and say, gosh, somebody said this really horrible racist thing to me, that it's going to be addressed. That's part of what creates a safe space. A safe space isn't a perfect space, but it's a space where it's safe to name our concerns and to bring our whole selves. So I mean, y'all know, I actually think this is probably something collectively we can answer better than Keith and I ourselves can answer. Like what creates safety for you in a space, or when have you not felt safe in a space, and why was that? And so what allows, so I don't know if people want to jump in there with when have you felt safe and why, or when have you not felt safe and why in a space or in a community?
Well, I'll speak if I can. It isn't so much about me, but our child is non-binary, and so doesn't see himself as male or female. And so this was all, we were all becoming aware when they were about 16 years old, and they went off to Vancouver after graduation, and I think we just all thought United Churches are, inclusive and welcoming of and we just thought, well, in a bigger city, it'll be better, right? They'll just be way better at it than we are because they've dealt with it before. Well, Andre went to a church. We went there to sort of see what it was like, and ended up getting a job, actually, is working with Sunday school, and thought, well, this is great. They seem to accept me and my name and my pronouns. But when it came right down to it, and it was time to write Andre's biography for the website, they wouldn't put their pronouns in properly, and so the relationship kind of fell apart. And I think part of it was that we were all just so disappointed and disillusioned because we just thought this is the United Church, and we are accepting and inclusive and welcoming, and we found out that we're not. And yeah, and so this affirming process sort of came up after that, really, once I realized that, oh, there's a formal way to do this so that we can be better. And yeah, so I think that was a little bit heartbreaking, to go there and to think, that they were going to be accepted, and they felt not. And so it's too bad, but we learned a lot, and here we are today. And yeah, so that's just that's my experience. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've just within the last year sort of discovered that I am non-binary, and I've joined a non-binary group, an online non-binary group that gets together every Thursday evening, and I really feel safe there. And I mean, not that much has changed for me, but things that I didn't think would matter to me, things that I thought, wow, this isn't really relevant to me, have become relevant, And I sat there one evening and they were going to talk about pronouns. And I thought, pronouns. Well, I go by she and her, but I also go by they and them. I'm changing things, and this group has been so wonderful for me. Just knowing that the word siblings is so much better than brothers and sisters. It's just, I love it, and I use it in my worship. When I read scriptures, I say siblings. When I talk about God as our parent, as opposed to father. And it's been meaningful for me. Been really meaningful for me. And so that group has been a safe place for me, a really safe place. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks, Lou.
One of the things that I've heard again and again from racialized people in our church, particularly folks who might have emigrated recently, but that's not always the case, is when folks are unwilling to make the effort to learn how to say their name. And it happens a shocking number of times where somebody will introduce themselves and the community, rather than learning their name, will say, can we just call you, right? You know, some abbreviation of their name or some other name. And it became really clear to me one time when I was up in Labrador, actually, and I was introduced to the minister there who was from Zimbabwe. And I was introduced to him as Benjamin, and that's great. And I was chatting with him, and then I was very tired when I arrived. So I'm like, oh, remind me again what your name is. And he told me his name, and it was not Benjamin. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So then I started using the name that he told me, but I noticed that everybody else was calling him Benjamin. So at one point I took him and said, why is everybody calling you Benjamin? I thought you told me that your name is this. He says, that is my name, but nobody can pronounce it. And I said, sure they can pronounce it. Of course they can pronounce it, but they're choosing not to. And what I know is that had, like, that was, well, he's not there anymore. Let's just say that. He's not there anymore. Because it was actually really clear to him, and it was just one symptom of many, that he was welcome to be their minister as long as he was like them. But his whole self, his true self, wasn't welcome, right down to his name. So even those things that we can do, like learning to say the names and learning to understand the accents that are unfamiliar, that makes a huge, it's essential. If somebody wouldn't call me by my name because they didn't want to bother to learn how to say it, or they said, you know, you can't be our minister because we can't understand your accent. It's like, anyway, it's horrifying that it gets said, but it does get said. And we're going to talk more specifically about race stuff, but all of those things, and they might seem like small things at the time, all of those contribute to a space being safe or not safe for people. Right? Not saying it's not hard sometimes to learn to understand an accent, or, you know, it takes several tries to get that name, but the fact that we try makes a difference, and the fact that we don't try makes a difference. You were going to say something.
I was just going to say that in the conversation about making safe spaces, and Jordan's already said this, we're going to screw up. We're going to make mistakes. I still to this day struggle with brothers and sisters. It was part of my indoctrination, I guess, if you want to call it that, into the church from the time I was a small child. And so even though I'm, you know, very supportive of affirming process and inclusion and diversity, sometimes I just screw up and say things that, you know, and sometimes it's kind of horrifying sometimes, because I've caught myself doing it in worship, which is the worst place to do it, in my opinion. But I think that in the process of creating a safe space, to acknowledge that mistake, or to, you know, go to the individual and say, I'm sorry, you know, in the doing of that, helps to create an environment where that person knows that it is a safe space, and where the congregation can hear, oh, you know, he screwed up, he meant to say folks, and he said brothers and sisters, you know. And so I think that while there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot that we have to change about how we relate to people as Jordan just said about basic name, um, that we need to cut ourselves some slack as well, and acknowledge that we're going to make mistakes, and that we just need to live into that, and acknowledge that, and hopefully the folks that it affects will also see that in us, right? So
Can I,
the
to
next,
that, can,
go ahead.
can I,
Yes, please
sorry,
go
can I
ahead.
pick up on that, Keith? Because
Yeah,
actually, I
absolutely.
just want to share with you some wisdom from a former moderator, Peter Short. Some of the best wisdom he ever communicated to me was that part of our role as leaders in the church, and many of you are leaders in
Yeah.
one capacity or another in your church, part of our role as leaders is to model good failure.
Yeah.
To teach people how to fail well, because failure is not optional. We all fail, right? But and so many of us have a fear that failure is like somehow like that's the end, like you can't come back from that, or like failure turns into a source of shame. So to model good failure, so when we fall down, what does it look like to get back up in a good way? How do we come back from screwing up? It gives people permission to fail and get back up again. So those screw ups can actually become incredibly important gifts to community if we practice good failure. So just wanted to pick up on that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jordan. So maybe just moving on a little bit, I just want to talk about justice seeking for just a few minutes. I want to give Jordan time for some conversation around race, but I think that what I'd like to say about that is that becoming an affirming congregation, going through the affirming process, will only enliven your role within your own community, but within the community at large as a justice-seeking place. Because affirming ministries are not gay churches or indigenous churches or single issue communities. They work on a variety of justice issues, right? And they know that the work of healing and justice making, of being the church, is an ongoing part of who we are. And whether they strive to combat racism or work to make their buildings accessible, as they attend anti-poverty marches or Black Lives Matter marches, or seek to live out the United Church's apologies on residential schools, when they honor children and provide space for addiction and support groups, that work for justice on sexuality or gender issues often supports or integrates with other work for justice, like anti-racism, like economic justice, environmental justice. And so the process that you're going through is going to only enliven and there's another word I'm trying to think of. I can't think of it. It's gone. But it's going to enliven that you as a justice-seeking church, which I know you are. And so I would like to, when you are going through your conversations, to think about how what you're doing intersects with the other justice work that you're doing within your community, and to think about the sort of the main tenets of social justice work, that being education and partnership and advocacy and becoming allies, to think about all of that within the context of your affirming process, because it all intersects in very important ways. Jordan.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And that intersectionality, like, means that the work that we do around justice in one area can inform and enhance the work we do in another area. So in some ways, as you're going through the affirming process, by its nature, it begins with gender and sexual identity as its sort of issue that it starts with. But that necessarily, as you're sort of thinking through justice issues related to LGBTQ2I plus folks, that plus gets, it moves beyond those same principles apply to folks. Like, so if we want to be a community that is welcoming of and inclusive of and a place of belonging for folks with disabilities, well, all the work you've done around LGBTQIA2+ inclusion is going to inform and enhance that work. We could begin with race and move from race to queer. We can begin with disabilities and move from disabilities to poverty, to queer, to race, because in some ways the processes are all very similar, and although they all have their own unique qualities. So as you're thinking about being an intercultural church and an anti-racist church, many of the things that you learn along the way as you seek to be a queer affirming church are just good practice, right? So as we're looking at our space for how would a gay or lesbian couple who come in here, how would a trans person who comes in here feel a sense of belonging or not, we can ask the same questions. How would a racialized person who comes in here feel a sense of belonging or not? How would, although in some ways that one's harder for many of us to answer, because most of us know someone who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, two-spirit. Most of us know somebody who's racialized, but haven't really got a clue what that experience is if we are not ourselves. And so in some ways, becoming an anti-racist church is probably the harder, in every way. Becoming an anti-racist church is the harder change to make. So it's great. Start with LGBTQIA because that's good practice run. Our lifelong work is to become a community of belonging and equity and love where whatever the human differences are that folks embody, people are fully welcomed and embraced and empowered and included and belong. That's sort of like, that's the kingdom of God. That's awesome. Not going to get there, but we can always be moving towards it. The one of the things I have seen and heard a lot is that communities lament that they see themselves as very welcoming, very very anti-racist, really striving to be a place of inclusion, and yet there are no racialized people there. There's all kinds of reasons for that. A lot of the reasons are probably that we haven't sort of moved past the welcoming stage, even though we feel like we have. As a church, I can say this, as the United Church of Canada, we have only barely moved past the welcoming stage as the church when it comes to racialized folks. And sometimes we haven't even got there yet. Despite all the work that we do, we still operate very much as a white church. That white culture, which is invisible to white people, and this is important, white culture is invisible to white people. So we don't see it, so we don't get how it's operating. But anyone who isn't white absolutely sees it, sees how it's operating, and is strongly impacted by it. And it's completely invisible to us. So that's why this is hard work. So what I try to say to folks is, as we move towards being an intercultural church, and the idea of intercultural is that folks who come from all kinds of different cultural realities, and there is such a thing as like queer culture or queer cultures, right? And so affirming stuff gets brought into the intercultural and like disability culture, deaf culture, blind culture, like all sorts of groups within society have distinct cultures that reflect their unique attributes. And so an intercultural space, an intercultural community is one where folks can come and bring what makes them unique and contribute it to what we share in common, and we can be like that. People don't have to park their identity at the door in order to belong, right? So that's sort of our goal. That's our kingdom of God goal. Our beloved community is this wonderful, equitable, intercultural community. But before we can reach that, I think what we often do is we think that our, or I guess we judge our progress on that by the diversity of faces. Like if we've got a diversity of faces then we're doing the right thing. And if we don't, then somehow our goal is to get a diversity of faces into the community. And it's almost like having a diversity of faces, I think, is a byproduct of doing the work, not the starting place. So it's not about, like, let's make sure that there's a certain percentage of our community that are not white, and then now we're an intercultural community. Because like this fellow up in Labrador experienced, he can be the minister of the church as a Black person. He's not in an intercultural community, right? Still very much white culture, white language. You have to have the right accent and the right name to really belong here, even though he and his whole family are, part of that church. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that this is like all of the affirming work we do. This is ongoing work. This is lifelong work for us as individuals and as a community. But this is where I'm going to share my screen. There are some, where'd it go? I had it open, must be here. Hold it. I opened something on my computer and it went away. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Sorry, folks. No, the interweb is against me today. I can't show it to you because it took me 5 minutes to find the document and it closed itself while we were speaking. So, but well, it might take you more than 5 minutes to find it. But on the United Church website, there is a document somewhere buried amongst United Church documents called Towards Becoming an Anti-Racist Denomination. And there's some really helpful stuff in there. But some of the highlights that I wanted to share with you, now I have to remember what they are, is that it isn't about that surface diversity, but it really is what we were talking about, that belonging, that empowerment, like who has decision-making power, whose culture is United Church culture, and who is otherized. And right now in our church and in most of our congregations, white culture is just the culture. So whether or not there are racialized people in our churches, we still operate very much out of a white culture, and most of our churches operate in English. And if you don't speak English, you probably are not singing any hymns in your own language or praying any prayers in your own language, and all of that. And one can always say, well, if the people who are all English speakers, why would we pray in another language, right? You're only going to pray in the language of the people who are there. And of course it's, yes, and there's lots of beautiful hymns that we can sing that are in other languages. And if we actually learn some of them and learn to sing them in the other languages, again, people see it. If, I can give you an experience when I was in Africa, and attended church, and the whole entire service was not in English, and that was fine. And then we sang a hymn that was in English, and I could sing. And wow, that made a difference. I mean, I loved the whole service. It was beautiful to just sit and listen. But I can tell you that if week after week after week I went to church and I couldn't understand anything that was being said, I'd stop going. But the fact that I could sing a song in my language made a difference, made me want to go back. I didn't go back because it's Africa and I don't live there, but I would have if I lived there. That would have been the church I'd have gone to, because we could sing or pray in my language. So part of our work is to examine how white supremacy, which is a scary term, right? Because when we think of white supremacists, we think of the folks who stormed the US Capitol, right? And we think of scary, people who toting guns. But white supremacy is simply a reality in the country, in the communities in which we live, is that white culture is dominant, and colonial thinking informs almost everything that happens in our churches and in our society. And that's not it's just the reality that we have inherited in this country. And the other reality is that we are racists. And if we load those terms with so much shame that we cannot allow ourselves to identify with them, we will never be able to do the work we need to do to actually become anti-racist. To become anti-racist is to recognize, acknowledge the presence of racism in ourselves and in our society, and to actively be working to dismantle it. So I can be a racist and an anti-racist at the same time. If I can't let the truth of my own racism in, I can't do the work of anti-racism, because I'll always be only seeing racism out there and pushing it back against that, and I will never be addressing the ways that I participate in it and practice it, and the way it lives in me and the way it lives in my church. So the work of becoming intercultural and anti-racist starts like right here. And I think that while our dream is that the incredibly beautiful diversity of humans all together, worshiping together, and this marvelous intercultural, multilingual space, like we hang on to that dream, and we realize that at most of our congregations in our lifetimes are not going to look like that. But we are beginning the work now to move ourselves, our communities, and our world closer to that by looking at how white supremacy and colonialism operate, learning about it, learning about white privilege and how it's functioning in ourselves and in our church, and working to dismantle it. It's slow, hard, often very painful work, and we get tripped up when our guilt and our shame get triggered. And so we need, again, a safe space is the place where we can do that work, where in fact we can, when we run into our shame, be able to name it and be able to say, yeah, my shame tells me that there's something wrong there. Not that there's something wrong, that I'm wrong, but there's something wrong going on, right? So like safe spaces help us stay in the work.
Yes.
They help us stay in the work and keep doing it. So I'm speaking now. I can't see everybody. So I don't know if everybody I'm talking to right now is white-skinned. So, but I'm speaking to those of us who are, right? For us, much of the white privilege and the white supremacy and the white culture and the colonial mindset that I'm talking about is that it is the air we breathe. And so we are not aware of it. And so that is why we absolutely need our racialized relatives to help us see it. Not like we have to make more work for them to come in and tell us. We need to read the books that are already written. We need to listen to the voices that are speaking. We need to take a deep breath when we get really triggered by some of that stuff and say, okay, that's hard to hear, but I'm going to keep on listening, right? And then allow that to inform the work that we do to chip away at. So this stuff, my suspicion is that this stuff is 100 times harder than the affirming, the queer affirming stuff, 100 times harder. Most of us, by the time we're starting an affirming process, we're kind of, yeah, let's go. Let's be inclusive. But I'm a racist. Okay, I am going off Zoom now, right? It's like, I don't want to listen to this. So this is the hard stuff. So here's the thing. This is not like, it's one foot in front of the other, right? It's just taking the next step. That's all we can ever do, is take the next step. We don't get to leap over all the hard work. We don't get to leap over all of the unpleasantry or all and get to the promised land. We got to go through the wilderness. And that's what this work is. That's what all this work always is for all of us all the time, is that wilderness journey. And every now and then we come to some sort of moment and it's like we get a taste of that promised land, and then we hang the heck on to that for the next leg of wilderness journey as we keep going. So on that cheery note, okay, so that sounds really heavy and hard. What excites me about this is, in my lived experience, this is the most liberative and life-giving work it is possible to do. Because as was sort of alluded to in something you said, Allison, at the beginning, we don't do this work for the sake of others. We do not do this work for the sake of others. We're not doing this for our queer friends and relatives. We're not doing this for our racialized friends and relatives or the people we know who are living with disabilities. We are doing this work because our own humanity depends on it, and because our own liberation is absolutely committed, like wrapped up in it. This is the work of our own salvation, and we can only do it together. And this is the abundant life to which Christ calls us. Like, that's like, so every time it starts feeling heavy, I'm like, oh, but this is this is the gospel. This is what Jesus promised us. He said, you get to die so you can live. So that's why sometimes it feels like death, but it's all about the life. So this is the life to which we are called. And yeah, a whole bunch of stuff in us has to die to embrace it, but that's the stuff that's just getting in the way of life anyway. So that's it. This is actually good news. I mean, this is exciting stuff. I live for this. We all do, actually. And so I just want to remind us of that, because this is actually, life-giving stuff. So let's, in the time we have left, which is not much because some of us talk too long, any questions or anything folks want to say?
In my lifetime, I've healed better. Am I there?
Mm-hmm.
In my lifetime, I've healed better the Native way. I've healed with Native people, and my husband also. We've gone to Native healing circles and healed there well. We restored our marriage in Native healing circle groups. I don't get the white therapist way. Native healers just get it, and white people don't. And I was in this Native healing circle, and I just stood up once. I didn't stand up. I just said, I'm going to get a t-shirt say white people suck. And everybody started laughing. But you know what? We suck. Native people get it and we don't get it. We think we've got it right and we got it all wrong. And our wrong-headedness is the problem. We got to start listening. We got to start getting it that we don't get it. From when I was a child, I was attracted to people who didn't think like we did. There was a Native girl just down they called it the Indian Trail. It was a concession just like any other concession road was, but there were Indians on it. And she was there, and her name was Susie, and I wanted to go to see her in the worst way, and I wanted to play with her, but my mother wouldn't let me because she was Indian, you know. And we went to school together, and I just have always been attracted to Native ways of doing things and otherness and other peopleness. And we just, colonialism and what our churches have done. May we be forgiven. And may we seek to hear and understand instead of telling, and instead of thinking we're teaching. May we hear and understand.
Thank you, Lou. So I don't see any questions in the chat. Brad made a comment, and then shortly after he made it, then Jordan, you started, talking about, inclusion and sharing for racialized persons, and how we really need to change our institutions to do that, and our worship committees, and sort of take it to our own level. So thanks, Brad, for commenting on that. And Elan found the document you were looking for and posted it in there.
Thank you, Elan.
Yeah, so that's good. And so Glenda has put a book in there for us to look at.
Excellent.
And Glenda's put a book in there for us too, so that's great. So I hope the chat saves with the recording, Brenda. So you'll, I guess you know more about saving the recordings, but yeah, I hope the chat's there too, because those are two good links that we could use. So I don't know if
I just have a comment.
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
It's Brad. So, Jordan, I'm curious as to your use of the terms white supremacy as opposed to white privilege. So what are your thoughts around that?
So, yeah, thank you for that question. So, so when I talk about white privilege, I'm speaking about the whole systems of privilege that I enjoy as a white person, that I sort of take for granted and don't recognize as privilege, but anybody who is not white-skinned doesn't enjoy by virtue of the fact that they don't have my skin color. Most of those privileges are, like I say, I'm just completely clueless to them. The privilege of not being stopped by security in a store, for example, when I'm just shopping, of not being pulled over by cops. There's no such thing as driving while white. It's not a thing you get pulled over for, but there is such a thing as driving while black or driving while indigenous. You get pulled over for that. So that's a privilege that I basically clueless about. White supremacy is the whole, I use that to talk about, I'm not talking about white supremacist groups. White supremacist groups exist. And basically, the way I see white supremacist groups is they are groups that are seeking to ensure that white supremacy remains, that the whole systemic structure which ensures that whiteness is privileged, and that ensures that whiteness is normalized, and valued above other racial identities, that remains firmly in place. So white supremacy it has all kinds of manifestations, legal manifestations. The Indian Act is a great example of white supremacy. We don't have a White People's Act that sort of outlines the special kind of laws that apply to white people, because white's just normal. But Indigenous identity, anyway, I'm not going to get into the whole Indian Act. So it's a legal structure, it's a social structure, it is a cultural value structure that just privileges and prioritizes and looks at the world through the lens of whiteness as the norm. And those of us who are white don't typically recognize how it operates, because it doesn't generally negatively impact on our lives in ways that are really obvious to us. It does negatively impact on us in the ways that it keeps us living comfortably with a system that dehumanizes our relatives. And for me, that's a threat to my humanity, to my own sense of myself, is if when I discover that I am living comfortably in a system that privileges me over others and that dehumanizes my racialized relatives. When I become aware of that, that's intolerable to me, which is why it's really important to maintain white supremacy, of us not being aware of it. So the more aware we become of it, the more uncomfortable we become with it, and the more we learn to recognize it, then we can begin to dismantle it. So they're related concepts, but that's how I'm using them, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time today, and I think we could have had, another whole workshop on these topics, and especially what we spent time on the last half hour. So I really want to thank everybody for coming. I don't know about anybody else, but I really learned a lot, and gives us so much to think about and so much to work towards, and as Jordan said earlier, to work towards, what is the ideal of the kingdom of God, and what is the ideal, what are we working towards, and all we can do is take one step at a time, and do our reading and do our workshops and speak to people. And I think it's been a great afternoon, and so our time with you was really special, Keith and Jordan, and I want to thank you so much for your time, and to Brenda for being our tech host today, which is like, wow, that's a really big thing for Brenda to have gone in the last 10 months to be able to be a tech host today, because she always says she's a Luddite, but I think she's doing very well, and thanks for that, Brenda. So that was great. You did great. So, okay. So thank you very much. And if you want to have any closing words there, Jordan or Keith, we really appreciate your thoughts, and it gives us so much to think about.
Well, thank you for having us. Even in the process of offering this to you this afternoon, I've been the benefit of our experience. I've certainly learned lots of things that I want to consider. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting us into this conversation, and for continuing this conversation amongst yourselves. Really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, I guess we'll say good afternoon to everybody then, and thanks for spending some time with us.
Bye, folks.
Have a good day.